I'm going to turn this over to our program chair, and we'll have our program. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Russ, fellow Lions and guests. Great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. I'm going to let him introduce himself. He pretty much local Washington, grew up here and graduated from Camas High. He'll tell you about your experiences after that and how he's our current recent city manager of the city of Longview. I do want to tell one story about him though. He came to us in 2005. I was on city council, and thereafter we had a retirement of our parks director. He was the assistant city manager at the time, and he took on the parks director's duties, which he held until he was advanced to the city manager position when Bob Gregory retired this year. So he's a dedicated public employee, and it's a great pleasure to introduce our city manager, Dave Campbell.
Thank you, Kurt, and former Mayor Adingnostu. I appreciate that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today speaking with the Pioneer Lions Club. Over the years that I've been in Longview, I've often heard of the Pioneer Lions Club, almost always in a very positive and productive capacity. But that's, I think, is my first opportunity to speak to you, and I hope it's not the last. Hope there are other opportunities in the future when there are particular issues or topics you want to hear about from the perspective of a staff person who works for the city. I'd be glad to come back and do that again sometime. Today I'd like to, as Kurt mentioned, kind of introduce myself personally, a little bit about my professional background, and just touch briefly on some of the current issues that are facing the city of Longview. They're not any surprise if I mention water or if I mention photo enforcement. I think you're probably all well familiar and probably have some opinions, certainly some questions, and hope we have time to address some of those today too. As Kurt mentioned, I'm a native of the state of Washington for the most part, although I was actually born in Idaho and lived for the first 5 years of my life on the Clearwater River in Orofino. I don't remember much about that, but that's what my parents tell me. We moved around as I was growing up. My father, who's passed away now, was a Methodist minister. If you're familiar with that denomination, there's a bishop that kind of transfers the ministers around from time to time. So we moved around a couple of different communities as I was growing up, and eventually found our way to Camas, upriver from Vancouver. Camas at the time was a lot different from Camas today. When I lived there for most of the 1960s, I don't think the population sign at the city limits changed when we moved there and when we left. Now it's really transformed since the construction of the I-205 bridge in the mid-1980s. That whole East Clark County area, including Camas and Washougal and those other communities, have changed a lot from what I remember. After high school, I went to college in Tacoma at the University of Puget Sound. Any other loggers here for any? Okay. Once a logger, always a logger. Got my undergraduate degree in political science from the University of Puget Sound. Didn't know exactly what I wanted to do with that degree at that point after graduation, but within a couple of years I decided to go on to graduate school. Went to Indiana University in the mid. Any Hoosiers here? Guess not. Have a master's degree in public administration from Indiana University, and took my first full-time position in local government with the city of Phoenix, Arizona. Worked there for 2 years. It was a great experience in a lot of ways, but I knew I wanted to get back to the Northwest and work in smaller communities than Phoenix. Phoenix as a city at the time was a great place to learn as somebody starting out in the local government management profession. But it was also unreal because it was a city where money was no object. That's never been the case since then in my career. It was growing by leaps and bounds. The decision every year in the budget process in Phoenix between the more conservative or the more liberal members of the council, at least in terms of spending, the more liberal, willing to spend tax dollars or to invest money, their position would be, we need 50 new police officers this year. The more conservative, the sort of the budget hawk said, no, we can only afford 40 new police officers this year. So that was kind of the dynamics of the debate in Phoenix at the time. It was very different from anything I've ever experienced since then. After a couple of years in Phoenix, I got my first opportunity to work in a city manager's office in Springfield, Oregon, also returning to the Northwest. And I spent most of the 1980s in Springfield, Oregon. I suppose Springfield, Lane County, was a lot like Cowlitz County in the 1980s, a really economically depressed time because of dependence on lumber and those sorts of resources, and very different from my prior experience of having worked in the large metropolitan area of Phoenix, Arizona. But anyway, Springfield was my first opportunity to work in a city manager's office directly. I eventually rose to the position of assistant city manager in Springfield, Oregon, and in 1988 was able to have my first opportunity to be the city manager, and moved up to Chehalis for that opportunity. So from 1988 to 2005, 17 years, I worked in Chehalis as the city manager there. 17 years is a long tenure for a city manager, perhaps too long. In any case, it was great to have the opportunity to not have to move too far, but to work in an area that I'm certainly very familiar with over the years. Come to Cowlitz County, worked for Bob Gregory as first his assistant city manager, and then in the combined capacity of assistant city manager and Parks and Recreation director. And as of almost 6 months ago, now the city manager for Longview. If you add up the years in my life, you can see that well over half of them have been spent in one corner or another of Southwest Washington. This is really my home, the area that I'm familiar with and certainly enjoy for a lot of different reasons. So it's nice to be here currently in the capacity of city manager, because that's my training, that's my experience, that's what I've always wanted to do. I didn't necessarily anticipate that when I came to Longview. I certainly would still enjoy working for Bob Gregory. He was a great person to learn from, somebody who mentored me. Even though I'd had a lot of experience of my own, I learned a lot from him, not only about city management, but especially about Longview and Cowlitz County with his experience. And just because of the type of person he is, the way he goes about doing his business, I appreciated that experience very much. But when he decided to retire, or at least to get out of the business of local government, I decided it was an opportunity. I at least wanted to take the chance to again have the opportunity to lead the organization from the top management position, and was fortunate enough to be selected by the City Council earlier this year. We're a little bit behind as an organization or as city government this year because of the process of going through that retirement selection process and having an appointment made in the spring caused us not to do some things that we would typically do in the annual cycle of local government here in Longview. We had a fairly late retreat in terms of the calendar year. We didn't do some of our public processes that we normally do in terms of adopting initiatives or goals for the city. So you see on your tables some handouts. They have a reference to 2014. That's because we didn't really have the time this year. It wasn't really at the point where we would typically go through a process of working with the City Council to either refine those initiatives, adopt new ones, drop some that perhaps had outlived their need for attention. But if you take that 2014 at the top and just imagine that it says 2015, there's really not much change for the time being in terms of the council's priorities. There is one change, at least symbolically, and perhaps it's more than symbolism too. The initiative that you see listed at the bottom there that refers to water quality and infrastructure, that's now at the top. And this week is particularly timely to be talking with you because some of you may know, you may have heard through the news media or read that we have an important report, an important presentation coming to the City Council this Thursday evening in a workshop setting. There won't be any decisions made this Thursday evening. There probably won't be any decisions made for several weeks, if not months yet, in terms of the recommendation from the Citizens Committee that's been involved in our water system review. But there is a process that we've been through in the last 7 or 8 months that has involved a number of people from throughout the community in evaluating the complaints, the problems, the challenges that we've had since beginning to get our well from our water from a well at the Mint Farm Industrial Park. The recommendation from this committee is that we return to the Cowlitz River and build or construct what's known as, it's either Ranny or Rainy. I've heard it both ways, and somewhere along the line, assuming this recommendation goes forward and we have this new system, we're going to have to decide what the real pronunciation is. But a Rainy system or a Ranny system, which is a well kind of underneath the river. It involves drilling down on the bank of a river and then extending laterals out into the river to collect water and treat it as necessary from that particular source. There are lots of different issues that still have to be considered in accepting this recommendation from our Citizen Advisory Committee. There's the entire feasibility of whether or not we will find a spot along the river that has enough quality, enough quantity, as well as the appropriate quality that can be treated to our satisfaction to provide safe and potable drinking water from that source again. The assumption is that it will work out, but there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to demonstrate to the satisfaction of the Department of Health and other people that will be involved in influencing that ultimate decision. But that's been a challenge for over 2.5 years now since we first did start drawing water from the Mint Farm wells. We have a recommendation for how to move forward and a lot of work that still needs to be done to make that happen. And also, as you can imagine, some additional costs that could have to be incurred in the process, multi-millions of dollars again, to go through the process of changing our source potentially back to the Cowlitz River. I'd be glad to take questions or comments about that in a second. I'm sure there are some observations or concerns from all of you here. If you're residents of Longview or even outside of Longview where we provide water, I know you've got some opinions, and some of you may say there's really nothing wrong with the water you've been receiving too. It's really interesting citywide, the diversity of reactions that we've had, some very favorable and some just think it's the worst thing that could have ever happened to this community. A couple other items I'll touch on real briefly though, also things that are in the news periodically, not so much during the summer because school's out of session, but during the year there are several locations around town where we have cameras that take pictures of vehicles driving through school zones, and if you drive too fast through those school zones, I would venture to guess that given the number of people in this room, there's at least 1 or 2 tickets that have been issued. Maybe more than 1 or 2 per household. There's some questions or opinions about that too. And one that has come out just recently is an opportunity to actually remove a school zone and remove cameras eventually. That's over on 15th Avenue, right next to Mark Morris High School. We have a grant that's been offered to the city to install a traffic signal at 15th Avenue and Mark Morris Court. If a traffic signal is installed there, that automatically takes away the school zone, takes away the need for photo enforcement. But there are pros and cons to this particular project too, and if you ask several different people, you'll get different reactions as to whether or not a traffic signal at its expense, even though it's mostly going to be paid for in the form of a grant, even at that expense, will that really solve the problem given the nature of students and traffic along 15th Avenue? So another issue that's been in the paper recently, not to be decided this week, but will come back for further discussion by the City Council in the weeks ahead. So that's a little bit about me, a little bit about the City of Longview generally in terms of our process and some of our current issues. Be glad to take some quick questions if you have them for the next couple minutes.
Can we ask you to stay afterwards?
I can do that.
Because we're on a tight schedule.
Sure, understand.
And thank you very much. And would like to present this mug to you for your favorite beverage. Thank you. He's agreed to stay after. If you've got some specific questions, you can come up and talk with him.